Very good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining us today at the EAI ISAS joint seminar titled India's Economic Ascent, Comparisons and Contrasts with China. This joint seminar will examine India's growth prospects and key hurdles, while also exploring the similarities and differences with China, as well as the lessons India might draw from China's development experience to sustain high growth and broaden its economic transformation. Today, we're delighted to have with us Dr. Ranil Salgado, Senior Resident Representative for India International Monetary Fund, Dr. Wang Tao, Managing Director, UBS Investment Research, Dr. Amitendu Palit, Senior Research Fellow and Research Lead, Trade and Economics Institute of South Asia Studies. And chairing the session will be Professor Alfred Skipke, Director, East Asia Institute, NUS, and Professor of the Practice of International Finance, Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. To commence the session, I would like to invite Associate Professor Iqbal Singh Xavier, Director, Institute of South Asia Studies, to deliver the welcome remarks. Dr. Xavier.
Professor Alfred Skipke, Director, East Asia Institute, National University of Singapore. Distinguished panelists, my colleague, Dr. Amitendu Palit, friends, guests. I'm delighted to see so many of you here. I'm delighted to see some faces that visit our events at ISAS, and I'm delighted to see some new faces that have not joined our events at ISAS. So this is a good collaboration where we're bringing a bigger group to discuss issues that both our institutes share in common. So I'm delighted today to welcome you to this panel discussion on India's economic ascent, comparisons and contrasts with China. And as I alluded to earlier, I'm excited that this is actually the second of a series of engagements that the Institute of South Asian Studies and the Institute of East Asian Studies are co-organizing that focus on issues that relate to India and China. And another one is coming up in September. You will all be bombarded on your emails with information for that. So we look forward to seeing you there as well. But to focus on this event itself, the focus of the discussion today will essentially be about highlighting certain comparative strands or steps that India and China have taken or not taken. It will also highlight to us some of the trajectories that India and China, economic trajectories, I should say, that India and China have charted, how they compare with each other, what lessons they can draw from each other. But I think another aspect that will emerge from the discussion is also the sort of challenges that both countries will face going ahead in charting their economic futures, but also the potential that both of them have, not only in comparatively dealing with each other, but also in the evolving world order. And as I mentioned, the evolving world order, I should highlight the point that all of us are painfully aware of, is that we can't talk about both of these countries without talking about the fact that they are negotiating their economic, geopolitical futures in an evolving world order. Now, this is a world order that has shaken up or promises or threatens to shake up a lot of what we've been used to. For one, the word tariffs apparently has emerged as the best word in the dictionary. Both India and China are dealing with this tariff negotiation issues. India has taken certain steps, and I'm sure we'll hear more of them in terms of trying to negotiate free trade agreements, etc. And we'll get into the gist of that shortly. But there's also another factor that makes this discussion very timely, and I'm deliberately trying not to preempt anything that the speakers are far more adept at discussing than me. And this other issue is the fact that India's External Affairs, Minister of External Affairs recently visited China. Now, this is the first visit by Dr. S. Jaishankar after the conflict over Galwan that happened in 2020. So this is interesting. We when we see such visits, we start to ponder if there's a potential development of relationship, if certain avenues for cooperation are going to open. While we look at that, we have to bear in mind that this is happening within an evolving global context, but also bear in mind the painful fact that there are points of tension that exist within these two countries. One of these facts is that both of these countries have been trading with each other for a very long time. the quantum of the trade and the balance of the trade is not something that everybody is happy with. That's one thing to bear in mind. The other issue is that there are a number of other tensions. While the border tension may be normalized for the time being, it is far from being solved. There are also other niggling issues that come out, be it issues over potential water disputes or the blocking of sales of fertilizers, etc. And I suspect this is the context in which some of the discussions need to be framed. But bearing that broader context in mind, there are also some points of economic similarities and contrasts that we need to bear in mind. Now we know that India's economy is growing and is projected to continue to grow. IMF figures. I'm afraid of speaking of IMF in front of my friend Ranil here. But from the figures, we see that India's growth is projected to be 6.2% this year and 6.3% next year. I won't go too much into that, but also highlight that while India is growing, India is also an extremely young country. And I think we have to bear these demographics in mind, especially when we compare it to the growth trajectory and economic trajectory in China. Now, I just want to make sure I get my figures right. India is projected to be, we all know India is the most populous country in the world now, but it's also projected to continue to grow. By 2050, it's projected to have about 1.668 billion people. And the point I want to highlight in particular is that a large chunk of this 1.668 billion people are going to be very young. The bulk of them will be under the age of 40. Now, apparently, 43% of India's population is projected to be under the age of 25. This is a huge working population. The question I think we have to raise is whether this will be a demographic dividend, or will this be a demographic problem that India will have to engage with? Because India will need to create massive amounts of jobs for this. Now, if we compare this with the case of China, we know that China's economic rise as a manufacturing hub was linked to the fact that China's demography was in its favor. China had a young population and a growingly young population at that as well. So that aided China's rise. Now, it's very easy for us to extrapolate from that China had the example, India has a young population, etc. There's another twist in the tail. The manufacturing sector has changed. Even those in the West who in America want to bring jobs back to America have to grapple with the fact that technological advancements, the advancements of AI, for instance, have changed the way manufacturing works. So one of the things we know that China did after opening up in 1978 was it invested heavily in education, invested heavily in infrastructure. India is investing in these domains, but I look forward to hearing how these investments are playing out, and do we see a similar ability to bridge that gap there. So these are some of the big issues that I want to just leave as framing points, but also highlight that at the same time that we look at India's population, we also have to think about China's population trajectory as well, because China is having an aging population trajectory. So is the United States. So how do we then look at how manufacturing, but also trade relations are going to be evolving in this context itself? Now, I don't want to say any more because I want to actually hear from the experts, but I will end by this fact that we all are familiar, and Alfred, we were just talking about the digitization that's going on in India. One of the things that India has invested heavily in is digital connectivity and digital infrastructure. Now, this is something that perhaps has placed India to be in a favorable position to jump into the fourth industrial revolution. Now, that will have significant implications on the economic sector, but also on job creation sector as well. So these are some of the broad points I hope to hear from our speakers. And on that note, I thank our speakers for joining us for this discussion. And I hand over the floor to Alfred to chair the discussion. So thank you all for joining us today.
Thank you very much, Iqbal. I'm equally pleased to do this series jointly with you personally, but also the whole institute. I just want to repeat briefly, introduce our speakers. You have the full bio, but maybe just a few points. Ranil Salgado, former colleague of mine at the International Monetary Fund, is truly an India expert. He's currently the senior res rep for India not only India, Maldives, and Bhutan as well. But in his previous incarnation, he also was the mission chief for India. And I think your first assignment was also on India. So he really knows India very, very well. And he's also the right person to be with us today, because in addition to India, he was also the mission chief for Japan. And this is the East Asia and the Southeast Asian institutes working together. So you're at home today. So thanks for joining us. Then we have another colleague of mine, Wang Tao, who is managing director at UBS Investment Research. The thing that I can tell you, and I personally attest to that, is she has been consistently ranked as one of the top China economists by institutional investors, knows China deeply, also former colleague of mine from the International Monetary Fund. And then, of course, my colleague, Mitendu Palit, who is the senior research fellow and research lead on trade and economics, the topics that we're going to talk about today at the Southeast Asian Institute. So with that, oh, by the way, I should mention that in his prior incarnation, he was also at two ministries, Ministry of Finance and Ministry of Industry and Civil Supply. So he really brings that institutional knowledge from India to the table. But with that, I think what we're going to do is we're going to start out. Ranil will give us an outlook, discuss some of the issues as we see India right now. Ranil, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Alfred, for that introduction. One thing I don't know much about is China. Let me start by saying that. And thank you, Iqbal, for your opening remarks as well. It's my pleasure to be here. I was a resident representative of the IMF, the first, back in 2005 to 8 in Singapore. So I visited various segments of NUS over time. So it's very happy to be back here. Just gonna look up there. I can point at, it should point at the computer. Okay, so my focus today is mainly to discuss India, both some of the long-term trends, a little bit on the short term, and then focus on policies that we think India needs to do. So let me start. Okay. Overall, as Professor Sevilla said, India's is at a favorable stage in its demographics. And so that, I think, means not just the short-term outlook is strong for India, but also the longer-term outlook. So going back since India first opened up to the world in 1991, India has grown consistently. If you look across decades and even shorter periods, it has consistently grown between 6 to 7%. More recently, it's actually been a little stronger, but we think that's primarily due to the rebound from COVID. And I'll speak a little bit about that later. And then second, what stood out at least is part of the story there is that macro policies and financial policies had led to very stable macroeconomic and financial economic stability, over most periods. India also continues to benefit from a number of landmark reforms. In 1991, it was opening up of the economy. Even before that, India had reduced internal controls. And then in the teens, you had a fairly substantial structural reforms that had occurred as well, such as putting together the goods and services tax. That was important in India because it lowered a lot of the barriers across states. Before that, each state had different taxes, and you were essentially within India, whenever you took goods across states, You would have border checks. So you almost had very strong internal barriers. And then from the macroeconomic point of view, that further fostered stability was the move towards inflation targeting. And then finally, I have there what is IBC. That's called the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code. So India has for a long time had difficulty closing down companies, right? So in economics, you want to reallocate labor from sectors that are not doing so well to sectors that are doing better. So in India, that has been an issue. It continues to be an issue, but the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code was intended to foster greater reallocation of labor and resources across firms. It has had mixed success, but all of these have supported underlying growth in India. But what stands out? So in terms of development, usually we think of the East Asian growth model as the way to develop fast. And the East Asian growth model was you first started with labor-intensive production, you built up skills, you built up your human capital. At the same time, you're improving the education of your workforce, and then you gradually step up. But India is very different in its growth model. India, for a long time, has had success in capital-intensive production. So if you think of what are the some of the areas of long-term success in India, there are pharmaceuticals, chemicals. India has done well for a long time. Those tend to actually be capital intensive. I would add here, in addition, they're also high skill intensive, right? So for pharmaceuticals or chemicals, you need very good engineers. And India has been able to produce those. But when you look at the Indian population, it's relatively low skill and abundant labor. So it's kind of flipping what you would normally think a country should do. Instead of focusing on labor-intensive production, it's focused on production in resources which it has relatively less of. And a lot of our recommendations that I'll go through later are focused on that issue. And then just going quickly into the short term, there was some concern that Indian growth was dipping below the 6% kind of number that I said the range was. Middle of last year, it appears that India is rebounding again from that. So that was a worry maybe 6 months ago, less so a worry today. Over the short term, you have fiscal issues, continued consolidation, monetary policy, perhaps could be eased going forward, but we think it's broadly neutral. And then last year we had what the IMF does on a regular basis with countries, a deep dive into the financial sector. It's called the Financial Stability Assessment Program. And it looked at the Indian financial sector, and it's stronger than it was, say, 5 years ago. But really, I think the focus of the discussion today is what India needs to do over the long term. So we have these structural reforms that there's been significant progress with. In the teens, things kind of have slowed down, at least in what you think are traditional structural reforms. India has continued on a couple of areas, one which Professor Sevilla talked about, which is its digital public infrastructure. But more broadly, India has done well in terms of public infrastructure over the last 5 years. And you see that if you go to India, by the way. You see new roads, et cetera, which is a good sign. And airports are much improved over even a decade ago. But some of the other reforms have slowed down. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that later. So this is basically what I said a little earlier, that since 1991, India has been growing between 6 to 7%. Here we added China. So India is in the green. China is the top line. Of course, China has had much stronger growth over much of the period, except recently, where Chinese growth has slowed down. And the positive story, of course, is India has been able to lift a lot of people out of poverty as well. I've already mentioned that it's been skills and capital and high skill intensive. What also is striking about India is even though agricultural value added has declined, and you'll see this a little more in a couple of minutes as well, the jobs remain heavily in agriculture. The jobs remain heavily in rural India. India has the Prime Minister has said the India's goal is to reach advanced country status by 2047. And to achieve that, their growth has to accelerate even further from this 6 to 7% range to upwards 8% or higher. It is working now. So I mentioned earlier, you could see on the left side how contribution to real value added in GDP has changed. So the blue bar there is agriculture. You can see it's shrinking. Manufacturing's in yellow. Not really expanding much for a developing country. And then in red, you have services sector, which is one of the bright spots in India. But then you look at the distribution of agriculture, even though the, distribution of employment, even though employment in agriculture has declined, it's declined relatively slowly. And that is a concern. If you look at more recent data, it looks like employment and labor force participation is rising. But it really is again in rural India. And if you could look at the numbers more closely, it is in areas that tend to be unpaid family workers or working for yourself. So self-employed or unpaid family workers. So the question we have is this good jobs that India is producing? And it appears though that it isn't. And some people actually says that's why the BJP underperformed. Prime Minister Modi's government underperformed the last general elections earlier last year. It's because of this jobs issue that India is not creating enough good formal jobs. This just shows that when you look at labor productivity, it does very well in manufacturing and services, but where a lot of workers sit and work is in agriculture, the black line, and productivity remains very low. And this just finally shows that the kind of the lighter bars there is how much capital. So that's showing that India's growth has been more in capital intensive sectors. Okay, just quickly to go through what is the shorter term issues. So growth has recovered from a low point in the third quarter of last year. That partly reflects a slowdown in public capital expenditures by the Indian government because they had a number of elections last year. And there are certain rules that in the Indian constitution that sometimes prevents executions of some of those projects ahead of elections. So there was a slowdown, partly reflecting that. But the other part of the story, when you exclude the government sector, is what's happening in the private side. So after COVID, there was a very strong rebound in urban consumption, but not a rebound really in rural consumption or in private investments. And in particular, the lack of a rebound in private investment stands out for us because you would think India should do better in private investment for two key reasons. One is usually public investment is complementary to private investment. So when you see a lot of capital expenditure in infrastructure, you think that will support private investment. And second really is the China Plus One story. So everyone I think thought that India would be one of the main beneficiaries of China Plus One, but the benefits have been quite limited. The one successful sector is handheld smartphones. Probably you've heard of Apple moving a lot of its facilities, especially for export to the United States, into India. But, and also, it's not just Apple, also Samsung has moved some of its production to India. But in other sectors, India has not done as well. So India, in addition to having these benefits from capital investment, as well as the China Plus One story, had some subsidies for production in many sectors. They were called production-linked incentives. There were 14 sectors, and really the only success is smartphones. So that stands out. So part of the story was corporate investment remained weak. The other part of the story was rural India consumption was weak. That's changed a little bit in terms of consumption. Rural consumption is rebounding, urban consumption is slowing down, but private investment remains weak. I won't move quickly through. I don't think we need to talk about risk so much. Just to briefly touch on the forecast, Professor Sevilla said 6.2 and 6.3 for the next 2 fiscal years. We'll actually have an update next week. I can give you directionally, the numbers will edge up a little bit, largely because we think uncertainty is declining. We're hoping there's a relatively positive news in terms of a US-India trade deal. That goes into part of the assumptions that we will be upgrading our assumptions a little bit next week. By the way, that's for within this room. I won't go into great detail here other than to say we think fiscal consolidation is important to maintain macroeconomic stability. India is barely an investment grade country in terms of its sovereign. And the reason for that is mainly because it has a very high debt service interest payments relative to the revenue it generates. It's 30%. It stands out among all investment grade countries. So India needs to continue to consolidate. And we think at this stage, it has to be a revenue-based consolidation because India has significant development needs, not just in hard infrastructure, but also in some of the soft infrastructure, mainly in health. Less so in education. We think India spends enough on education. It just has to be more efficiently spent. If you're interested in monetary policy, we think it's broadly neutral at present. Though if numbers come in weak, we think there's room to cut. So if anything, we think there's more room to cut than increase. As I mentioned earlier, we did this deep dive into the financial sector. Generally, India's financial sector is in good shape. Capital adequacy is very high, is relatively high. For example, non-performing loans, so asset quality is relatively good. India had 2 substantial financial sector crises in the teens. First for the commercial banks, then for the non-bank finance companies. They've taken significant steps, including the Reserve Bank of India becoming regulating the non-bank finance companies, earlier steps in terms of resolving the asset quality in the banking sector, as well as significant consolidation among public sector banks. And the financial sector we think is strong, with the caveat there are pockets of vulnerability. They tend to be public sector banks, some of the smaller ones, as well as some of the non-bank finance companies. Okay, moving on to areas where I think India needs to take steps. So we think the strong macroeconomic fundamentals provides an opportunity for India to address structural issues. And what this shows is India against either emerging market benchmark or global market benchmark. And the larger the bar, the further India is from the frontier. And specifically, we show here judiciary, credit market, business regulations, labor, and then trade issues. And so there's room to move. We kind of highlighted the trade issues because that's an area where the central government can do more. The rest needs also support from the state governments. That's one of the issues India faces, is a lot of things are more under the control of state governments than the center. Many of the reforms going forward have to be done by the state governments. And this is breaking it down more clearly. On the vertical axis in green, you have what the center controls. In the orange, you have what is jointly controlled by the union and the states. And you can see in terms of these reforms, we have much more in the orange section than in the green section. And my time may be short, so I won't go through this in any detail. But focusing on a few issues. First is trade, because we think this is one thing that the center can do. And by the way, the bars on the right side are our estimates of the potential gains, but let me talk more through in my limited time what we think are the important steps they need to take, which is one, they have both relatively high, India has both relatively high tariffs and relatively high non-tariff barriers. In fact, some of the new non-tariff barriers, what in India are called quality control orders, were specifically designed and targeted against China. But knowing the Indian bureaucracy has expanded it to effectively be a non-tariff barrier on all countries. So we think that there's opportunities to lower tariffs as well as to lower non-tariff barriers. And this can be part of bilateral agreements or regional agreements as listed there. The other issue that has been highlighted when among many foreign investors into India are in the teens, India effectively suspended all bilateral investment treaties and wanted to shift to a new model investment treaty, which was more where arbitration would occur in India. This becomes problematic because if you know earlier, I skipped through it very quickly. One of the main problems in India is its judiciary. So many foreign investors didn't really trust to have arbitration in Indian system because it can take Indian judiciary takes a long time, and the view was even arbitration in India would take a long time. Overall, we think it's important for India to take steps to reignite private investment. The left side chart shows in per capita terms it shows the needs. Capital stock is very small in per capita terms, especially if you think India needs to become an advanced country. I would note here with the caveat that at least in percent of GDP, private investment overall looks okay. But in terms of per capita, investment is far too low and capital stock is far too low. And these are the potential benefits of improving by 25% that gap by taking steps to reduce that gap in terms of business regulation, judiciary, and the credit market. What are the potential gains in terms of improving private investment in India? And the last area, and this is something that Professor Sevilla also touched on, is how to improve labor's contribution to the economy. Point one, India has been driven by capital-intensive production, and I would add high skill intensive. But what the graph on the northeast corner shows is the potential benefits also not just of improving the education system, but of improving training. The southwest corner is potential gains, and the right side is just to the south east corner is just to show that health needs to improve in India as well. And I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. Maybe just 2 or 3 kind of summaries of what you highlighted. India's growth performance, 6 to 7%, on a good path. However, if it wants to reach its target of becoming a high-income country by 2047, it needs almost 8%. And also, in order to create enough jobs, maybe growth needs to be even faster. Key part is a lot of employment in a low productivity sector, in agriculture. We'll probably come back to that. The political economy of changing that is probably one of the biggest obstacles. And then in the terms of the short term, on a good track, continued fiscal consolidation, focus on revenues, monetary policy, okay. If data comes in weak, maybe there's room for some cuts. Financial sector, after the kind of crises that we had over the last 15 years, more resilient, maybe continued focus on the non-bank financing company sector. And the key ultimately is, and I think we'll talk more about that, structural reforms, including on trade barriers and non-trade barriers. Thank you very much. Maybe with that, I could invite Tao Wang to give us a little bit of a reflection on China and India, some of the similarities, or I think mostly differences. But
Thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me. I'm very excited to be here. My first India-China event was actually in 2003 in Delhi, organized by IMF. That was when I was the desk on China for IMF, and that was, at the time, China-India comparison had just begun. And I'm sure, we will continue to compare and contrast for a while to come, because the two countries do have a lot of similarities. Today, I would like to focus on just one aspect. There are a lot of similarities. We talked about demographics, but of course, the size are the same, complexity, and also both countries are very proud and of its uniqueness and want to walk its own path of development. So those are very similar. Today, I'm going to focus on the manufacturing, because right now, a lot of comparison between China and India, especially in a global environment of geopolitical shifts and supply chain realignment. So a lot of question is, can India replicate China? Can India be the next China in manufacturing to some extent? And so I'll focus on this. I'm not obviously going to be able to give that answer, but I want to look at China's rise in manufacturing to say, what are some of the experiences, some of the successful factors, some of the flaws as well. So in terms of China, obviously in the last 30 plus years, China has developed very rapidly. Now, what's very notable is rise in manufacturing. So China became sort of the powerhouse of manufacturing, the factory of the world. And so its manufacturing share more than quadrupled in a quarter of a century, in 22, 23 years, reaching almost 30% in 23. That was the last data I wrote on. I think the rise of China's manufacturing was driven by two key factors. One is China's accession to WTO and therefore greater access to global markets. Typically, press and so on only focus on that, but there is also, of course, a very powerful domestic factor, and which is the rapid domestic demand for consumption and for investment from that urbanization, property development, industrialization as well. So these are twin forces, twin engines that drove China's growth. And if we look at the manufacturing, the key message, I think, there are some common factors that people point to China's success, which included abundant, cheap labor with adequate education. I have to emphasize that as well. A good infrastructure, open to international markets and open to competition, ability to attract foreign direct investment, and of course, in this case, less relevant to India, but in China's case, is the rise of private enterprises and the bigger role the private enterprises played in this process. So if we compare India and China, I wanted to say that we shouldn't compare India and China right now, because India, the manufacturing size is relatively small. It's about 3% of global. China is 30%. So obviously you would say, oh, India cannot replace China. But I wanted to look at it from a long-term perspective in terms of catching up and look at India's conditions right now, some of the fundamentals compared to when China was starting to take off 25 years ago, and are they similar? So, so I think India have actually a lot of those conditions, as we saw, as I can show you a bit later on. A lot of factors are coming into place, including infrastructure, labor, and so on. Renil just talked about infrastructure has greatly improved and continue to improve. And India, of course, although it is already a WTO member, so it doesn't have that jumping force of China 2001, but the global environment right now is quite favorable for India. Compared to China, I guess, you know, when I say that, we have to keep in mind that, of course, Trump is imposing tariff on everyone, so it's not that favorable. But relative to China and so on, India is likely to get a much lower tariff, and the international markets are more favorably disposed to India. India also has a very large domestic market that's growing rapidly. That is also very fundamentally important for driving the growth of manufacturing. As I mentioned, China had twin engines. One of it is domestic demand, although it's domestic investment demand. But in India, it's more domestic consumption demand. Nevertheless, there is a large market that's growing. So the only thing now for India, of course, is the manufacturing sector is relatively small. But if we look at some of the fundamentals, look at the demographics. So the two countries are relatively the same in size. In terms of the labor force, the young labor force, India's average age of the labor force is similar to China about 20-some years ago. In terms of the educational attainment, over the last 2-3 decades, India always compared to seems unfavorably to China. But if we look at what India has already achieved, which has seen great improvement in education, we see that its educational achievement of its labor force is very similar to what China had, at the turn of joining WTO. So you have some of the fundamentals aligned in terms of manufacturing wages. India now is also very similar. It's obviously much cheaper than China and similar to China was 20-some years ago. In terms of infrastructure, these are some measures from the World Bank, from logistics, various agencies. So this is still a bit old in terms of data, but I think as Renil mentioned, the basic trend is that India, since actually last 10-15 years, have been spending quite a bit more on infrastructure. It has not spent as much as China did back then, but still relative to its past and in terms of trend, infrastructure is definitely improving as well. Another thing that we wanted to just go back to is China's success is open to international markets. And I wanted to mention that China's opening to international markets didn't just happen with WTO. It happened in the 7-year run-up to WTO accession, because China applied to join the General Agreement of Trade, the GATT, in 1987. It was almost done in 1989, and 1989 Tiananmen Square happened, so that was all suspended, and then it took a long time until 2001. But in this process, China's import tariff, went down from about 40% to about 16% before WTO entry, and after WTO continued to go down. So that reform and opening was a process, was not a one-day switch, right? It took a long time. And India's tariff now is at similar level. I mean, it's still relatively high, but it's similar level as China was at the entry of WTO. But of course, there are some non-tariff barriers as well. And in terms of measured by the openness, so India's trade as a share of GDP is relatively small, but China was small as well. But if you look at trade and services, then they are similar to China was 20-some years ago. So the difference between India and China is, compared to at the brink of China's rise of manufacturing, is not that different, right? And we are very easily comparing the success today of China with India today and say, well, that's not going to happen. But if you look at China 20 some years ago, and then looking back, then you think, well, India actually have a lot of favorable conditions that are lining up. Of course, you need, as Renio said, you need policies to continue to move in those directions, especially in terms of structural reforms. And so the things to monitor, because I, even though I did a comparison with China, India, but I was mainly doing the China part, even so I have remained a China specialist. But I've worked with my India colleagues and, just echoing what Renio had said, there's obviously we need to look at some of the regulations and reforms in the labor market, in land reform, and also continued infrastructure investment. Energy supply, that's another thing. As you may be aware, China in the last 20 plus years was the single most important driver of the global commodity market, energy market, in terms of oil and coal and iron ore and things like that. I very much doubt India will go the same path, because the difference is China's urbanization and local government driven sort of infrastructure drive made China's growth very energy commodity intensive, and India probably is not going to repeat the same path, which is highly costly and maybe not easy to achieve at this moment. So these kind of things, but nevertheless, what kind of infrastructure investment India can continue to go through. And also, of course, what we need to monitor is the continued realignment of the global supply chain. Right now, given, I think a few months ago, most people thought that US will target China and will not impose a global tariff seriously on the rest of the world. So global supply chain will move away from China. But now, after all these ups and downs and on again, off again movements, I think nobody can be sure. So there's a lot of uncertainty. Against that uncertain environment, initially, I think, at this stage, what global companies are doing is to stay put, because we don't really know. Should we move to Vietnam? Should we move to India? The initial tariff on Vietnam proposed was higher than initial tariff on April 2nd on China. So there's a lot of sort of suspended move. Going forward, I don't think anybody will have a clear idea. We will have probably a more fragmented supply chain going forward. And so within this structure, I think India still has a lot of opportunities. I would bet that India will have lower tariff, end up with lower tariff than China has, and that's most likely. And as I mentioned, India, of course, has a very large domestic market. Increasingly, global manufacturers are moving to India, not necessarily use it primarily as an export base, but as a place where they can supply the very large markets there as well. So I think against that background, there are obviously things we need to watch and see how India will go forward. Here is a couple of things I wanted to mention about, again, the similarities and differences. So in terms of the reform, for China, obviously, it was more of a reform from central planned non-market economy towards a market economy that helped that rise. In India, you have maybe regulations, you have different and complicated judiciary system and so on. But I wanted to mention this, right? And so when we look at China and look at India, so typically people who look at China tend to get especially for someone who looking at it for 30 years or so, then you feel many of the questions remain the same. Many of the struggles, many of the reforms seems to move so slowly. But then you look at back, the country has developed rapidly despite all these challenges. And I would say also similarly for India, the questions, the challenges, regulations, infrastructure, we hear about this all the time. And for me also 20 plus years. But you look back, India has also developed quite rapidly, maybe not as fast as China, but if you look at especially recently, right? So I think these things will happen despite of these challenges. And then we have to look at the specific, policies to address some of the issues. Another similarity I wanted to highlight, I think most people who look at China from outside may not be very keenly aware, is that China's government, right? People tend to think Chinese government is very powerful. You have one a small group of people, or even one person says something and things get done in China. That's not really the case, right? The role of local government, of provinces, very important, very powerful. And when China joined the WTO, arguably the biggest reform, the biggest change that brought to China is actually a lot of different regulations and different non-trade barriers within China was taken down because everybody had to meet the WTO standards and requirement. But nevertheless, a lot of different local barriers still existed. And even now, the Chinese government recently have been focusing on the so-called integration of the one market, one domestic market. And so in that essence, it's of course it's the political structure and so on is very different from India, but in terms of the role of local governments, the state governments in India, they are kind of independent politically and economically, but in China economically also the things were different. So there were that differences there were that similarities as well. So I think I'm sure there are ways to design policies, and there are ways for private entrepreneurs and foreign companies to find ways to move that forward, so that whether it's through attraction of foreign investment, through opening on trade and tariffs and so on, that can help reduce that local barriers in India as well. So one final thing I wanted to comment is the attraction of foreign investment. So China has been credited with its success of attracting foreign investment. At some point, almost more than 60% of China's exports were done by foreign companies. And now it's still 1/3, right? So that's very important. The foreign companies played a very important role in its rise in manufacturing, especially in the competitive part, meaning the part that's related to international markets. But during this course of China's development, there had been a lot of debate as well as to, yes, we want foreign investment, but are they making too much money? Are they crowding out national champions, state-owned companies? Are we losing state assets? And shouldn't we support more national champions, even the private companies? And we don't need their capital anymore after a while. Maybe we should have their technology transfer. Only if they can bring technology will we invite them or welcome them. So there has been these kind of debates and back and forth as well. I think looking back, certainly the opening up since '87 and the joining of the WTO, the fact that the central government initially, despite all these domestic pushbacks, stayed on course to say, yes, they may not bring new technology, but they are helpful to help employ our people. So I think those kind of things are things that we can probably keep in mind. Thank you.
think we're extremely good. We're right on time. So thank you very much, Tao Wan. Maybe just a few takeaways. I'm going to start with the last part, which I think is quite interesting. Maybe that will also be part of our discussion. That, you know, when you look at India and China, we think we're sometimes the farther you're away from those countries. It's just one homogeneous block. And the true story is a little bit more complicated, where states in India and local governments in China have their own objective functions. And there are at times a stumbling block for the development. And the question is whether along the lines of China, India can overcome that. What's the probability of that? The other component is this relationship to foreign direct investments. Yes, we want foreign direct investments, but we also have, as you called it, maybe some national interests. I think the key takeaway is humongous domestic market. So apart from linkages to the rest of the world, that's part of what makes India very attractive. And then you reiterated again, building on what Ranil said earlier, key is, of course, land reform, labor reform, infrastructure investment, and then this question about integrating into global value chains. And the question, I think, now in the geopolitical environment is that really the same as it was maybe 20 years ago? So that, with that, if I could pass on the baton to Mitendu to give us his perspective.
Thank you, Alfred, so much. And I think it was an enormous learning from the two previous speakers. Good to see you, Ranil, after several years. Thank you so much for the background that I've shared. And I'll just try to develop some of the ideas which have already been shared in terms of India, China, and the relative discourse. Let me start with what exactly has been the subject of today's conversation, India's economic ascent. Now, when we look at this phrase, India's economic ascent, I think there are two stylized facts, if we can call them, which symbolically describe this. The first is India becoming the world's third largest economy in another 4 to 5 years' time at most, probably by the end of the year. End of this decade. And the second is India becoming a developed nation, or typically the Viksit Bharat as we call it, by the year 2047. Now, please note this, that there's a considerable gap between the two. The fact that India becomes or will become the third largest economy in another 4 years' time does not mean that India is going to become a developed economy. It's going to take much longer than that. And let's just look at some numbers in that regard. What we have today in the world is the United States as the world's largest economy, contributing around $30.5 trillion as far as the GDP is concerned, followed by China, $20 trillion roughly. Now, between the US and China, they contribute more than 40% of the world economy. They are followed by Germany, India, Japan, UK in that order, with India and Japan kind of jostling for the fourth space together right now at $4.2 trillion, depending upon how deep you want to go in terms of decimal places in that calculation. But the point is, if and when India becomes the third largest economy, let's say by reaching $5 trillion, it will still be a very long distance away from where the next economy in the pecking order is, which essentially means that if today India is the world's fastest growing major economy at 6.2%, that journey from being the third largest economy to a developed economy will need to be maintained by not just that rate of growth, but a much faster rate of growth, and a rate of growth which has to be inclusive. Why is it got to be inclusive? Because when one looks at per capita income terms, India today is at a number of $2,481. When this is compared with China, China is at 12,000 US dollars. But if you compare it with the US, it is 82,000 US dollars. So I think the difference is palpable in terms of what the challenge lies ahead for India insofar as economic goals are concerned. And these are not simple economic goals. These are very strong economic goals that need to be achieved with the right combination of policies, economic management, and, if I could dare say so, favorable conditions, both internally and externally. On the back of what my previous speakers have already shared, let me divide my comments into two parts. The first is, let me highlight some challenges which are shaping up for India. And then I'll come to certain opportunities which are not much discussed and talk about. And finally, I'll talk about trade, because trade has been uppermost on the minds of most of us. And I just want to bring that fact into a little bit of the context. I think Ranil alluded to this fact, and this is indeed something which is of importance and to be taken note of, that since COVID, since 2020, we have been doing some work on this at our institute as well. We have had very high, robust growth in capital expenditure in India, public capital expenditure, which unfortunately has not seen a commensurate rise in private investment, and that is a matter of concern. So that issue probably needs much closer examination, that what is it that is holding back the private investment by the amount by which it should have been forthcoming by this point in time. But at the same time, there is also a concern over by what extent the state will be able to maintain the public capital expenditure, because unfortunately what in India is happening is that a large number of states in the Indian population are not contributing to the economic growth the way they could have. It's essentially 6 or 7 states of the country which are actually driving the national economic growth, and the remaining are largely being supported by public welfare programs. Now, that is where the government faces a dilemma, particularly the state governments in India. By what extent can they manage to support the consumption at the state level through public welfare policies and handout programs when these states are not generating sufficient revenues by themselves? So that's a challenge that needs to be handled at a considerably serious level of reflection. But this probably also has other implications coming up. So let's say, for example, when one looks at the revenue that is available for the federal government to be put into various welfare enhancing programs and asset creation programs, eventually it comes down to the GST that is being collected, a very large part of it. And the GST contributing states in India are barely 1/3 of the total number of states in India. So that again is a disproportionate idea of the way the Indian state is functioning. Iqbal in the beginning talked about this sort of billion of a billion questions, demographic dividend or liability. I think the challenge for India today is not even to consider the demography. The issue is to see what kind of a demographic characterization does its own population take? Because the biggest challenge that is coming up is for a country which is adding 15 million people to its workforce every year, annually. What are the kind of skills that are required to equip this population for the evolutions that are taking place in the world and outside? The good part is that this is something which has been anticipated through policy. This has been something which has been anticipated by both the government sector and the private sector. And there are a large number of initiatives and collaborations which are happening, including with Singapore. Singapore is one of the most prominent countries which is active with India on the exercise of skill building. And there are countries like Japan and Canada and Sweden which are also actively participating. So when I stop there in terms of the challenges which can come up from the domestic side, let me shift to two challenges which are clearly very strong on the external side. The first of this, again, briefly, as Ranil alluded to, the geo-economic fragmentation. The problem with all challenges that are coming up from the external side is that the Indian government doesn't have any policy lever to handle what is happening outside of itself. It is having to be a sort of a, event taker. It can't be an event setter in that respect. So at this stage, one of the biggest tensions are arising over what is going to happen to India's oil procurement strategies. Because there are serious complications that are arising between India's lifting of oil from its major sources across the world, including Russia, and the situation that is developing between United States and Russia and European Union and Russia on the second round of sanctions or secondary tariffs. What kind of implications this means for India's forward purchases of oil is something which needs to be thought out very carefully. But I think officially India has responded to these sanctions by making it very clear that India will, as always, look at its national interests in making these decisions. I also refer to another subject, which I don't think my previous speakers alluded to, but that's really becoming a sort of a serious factor as far as India's growth is concerned. That is the state of decarbonization in the economy. Now, the problem over here is that India is one of those countries which has experienced an enormous increase in extreme weather events. Now, on one hand, that is leading to economic displacement of populations along with livelihoods. There are socioeconomic impacts that are generated from it. But on the other hand, there's another factor to be considered if one looks at India's manufacturing and the industries that have contributed to this manufacturing, such as steel and aluminum and machinery and heavy industry. All of them are incredibly carbon intensive. Now, there has to be a process of decarbonization which has to start from here, but that decarbonization is not going to come without cost. Unfortunately, this is already being put down on India as a fait accompli through measures like the carbon border adjustment measure, which really is not leaving much options for industries and producers in India other than shifting to ways of taxing and pricing carbon internally within the country with the hope that that taxation will give them exemption from the carbon border tax while exporting to the European Union, which is very unlikely because the European Union's internal pricing of carbon is going to be much higher than the Indian domestic pricing of carbon. Now, on this, let me now just shift a little bit of gear to a set of numbers which I really think are going to be vitally important when India looks at the trajectory for the next 20 years. When we look at India's external trade, the latest numbers, India exported $450 billion of goods and imported $700 billion of goods, 2024. The total trade share between these exports and imports makes India account for 2.3% of global goods trade. This share increases to 4.1% of global commercial services trade. When we look at the services exports and the services imports, and this share increases to 5% when we just look at India's share in global digitally delivered services, where India ranks the 5th largest in the world in digitally delivered services and the 7th largest in the world in terms of digitally delivered services imports. What are digitally delivered services? What exactly are this, and why is India showing such a sharp rise in growth in these sectors? This is essentially because of the growth of a very interesting character of organizational supply chains that has happened in India, which shows the coming of age of its IT sector. India's IT sector began as a bit of a, off-site location IT sector, where people would migrate to locations in the advanced G7 countries for doing on-site work over there. Later, those people shifted and organizations shifted to doing back office outsourcing from India. Today, that entire concept has now advanced to a stage where the IT digitally delivered services chain are being managed internally in locations within India, within the single enterprises known as the global capability centers. Now, between them, these global capability centers bring a very different kind of perspective on the Indian economy. There are around 1,600 global capability centers, which are contributing of about 55% of the total global output that comes from global capability centers. So more than half of the global GCC output is getting generated from India. These are all engaged in high-value operations. Roughly 70% of the GCCs that operate in India are run by the Fortune 500 companies. This is one of the reasons why the India-US FTA deal is going down to the wire, because while many think that India's negotiating strengths are limited, they actually are not. Because a large number of GCCs are actually owned by the US big tech companies in India. So there's considerable interest in ensuring that that market turf is being protected. And they're employing around 2 million people, which is not a small number in India. And they're innovation hubs for Fortune 500 MNCs. Now, if this is something which is going to shape the way India is going to engage with the rest of the world, this needs to be looked at the back of the fact that India's share of manufacturing GDP has by and large remained stagnant. And it's unlikely to change much. Where the share is likely to enlarge and where India has to enlarge it is in services. Because the transition from the third largest economy to a developed economy cannot come just from domestic growth. It has to come from India occupying much larger shares of the global markets. And there, between services and manufacturing, it is probably services which is going to play a much more critical role over the next 20 years. And this is a statistic which is very rarely looked at insofar as the digital delivered services growth is concerned. But a significant part of this is actually captured in something which I'm just going to briefly talk about now, which is India's new FTA strategy. Now, what does India's new FTA strategy show? Who is India engaging with as far as FTAs are concerned? Day before yesterday, Prime Minister Modi and Starmer signed off the India-UK Free Trade Agreement. This basically is going to be the benchmark FTA as far as India is concerned. Insofar as the future FTAs are concerned, one expects the one with the European Union to be of similar scope, standard, and template. The India-US FTA is not really a FTA. It is more a bilateral tariff agreement understanding that the two countries are going to reach, much as the US has reached with most other countries. The issue to be noted over here is that when India has concluded FTAs with Australia, United Arab Emirates, and is engaging with UK, EU, and the United States, and also parallelly with certain other countries of the world, these FTA countries are among India's major trade partners. They're also the major sources of investment into India. And they are also reflecting India's greater engagement with the world on its west. Now, some people might say that this is a bias, but the history of India's FTA shows that if one looks back in the first part of the century and the first decade of this century, India's FTAs were all with industrially matured nations on its east. For example, with Japan, with Korea, with Singapore. None of them were on India's west. So this actually means complementary. And this is also a way in which India has been able to cover up for much of the large FTA space. Many feel it might have vacated. I'm sure that this audience will have interest in RCEP. The point is, today, India has FTAs or is going to have FTAs with all members of RCEP, except one. I will not mention who that is. Now, on that side, I think there's clearly this view also shaping up that India is beginning to look at free trade agreements not just as instruments of trade or economic benefit. They're clearly for India stepping stones to deepening security partnerships and strategic partnerships. And this is where economic security plays a vital role, because probably all these FTAs are going to bring that much of support and safeguarding for a large number of critical supply chains where India visualizes its future, including in services, including in clean technology, including in semiconductors, and a large number of other strategic sectors which are part of the country's economic security, like food and health. The question that arises over here is that what is going to happen in the current turbulent environment that India is facing along with a large number of countries? I think I'll be very practical over here. India does not have the capacity like Japan to invest $550 billion in the American market for protecting its dairy and rice markets. I didn't mention beef markets. India doesn't have that capacity. India doesn't have the capacity to give certain concessions which are being demanded across the table, like say, for example, opening up defense procurement to foreign businesses, mainly American businesses, because that's something which entails a serious amount of, domestic complications. India will find it extremely difficult to give up concessions in dairy. Dairy was the one which was one of the triggers for India backing out of RCEP. The trigger remains. So I think when the India-US deal comes out, what we are going to see is a half-finished deal on both sides. Because of India's inability not to give what the US is demanding, the US offer of market access for India will also remain limited. And India's main expectation in that is that the US sectoral tariffs for steel, aluminium, and automobiles be relaxed for India, like they are being relaxed for certain other countries with whom the deals are being achieved. Now, I don't really think the Indian establishment at this point in time is going to look at a very robust deal from the United States. It's not possible. But what is possible is that the trade discussion between India and the US continues, but continues in a complicated manner. Because when the demand for tariffs will go, after a point in time, on the realization that not much more can be achieved, the demand will shift to non-tariff demands. And that is where India is going to face challenges, because the negotiating context for India has become very complex since the time India began negotiating this deal in February. We have had issues with Pakistan, we have had issues with Russia, and we have had issues with the BRICS. All three taken together does not create for India a very enabling situation in which it is negotiating with the US, in complete contrast to the negotiations it is having with European Union. So I think India's long-term hope and faith will be that it is able to reproduce a modern and comprehensive deal like it has got with the UK, which incidentally opens up India's government procurement markets, it opens up India's digital trade, it opens up a large number of other sectors. It is a gold standard deal. It will expect it to be reproduced in the European Union FTA. What happens to the US, we will continue to watch and see. I'll end with one point, which I think is a point where there is a China-India convergence. I think both countries are now getting close to following a policy of making a strategic use of an economic asset, and that is their currencies. This hasn't come in a planned way. China has used its currency as a strategic tool for obtaining economic influence in a variety of ways. India has started making similar use of its currency. I don't know whether this is de-dollarization, but there is no denying the fact that between and China, the tendency to shift away from greater dependence on the American dollar is obvious, because the American dollar's share in global trade invoicing today is far, far more than what it is share in global trade. I think this imbalance clearly contributes to the American hegemony, and that is something which sometimes becomes costly for certain economies to bear, and which is pretty much evident in many respects of the global economic order that we are seeing. So what I would end on is a certain bit of optimism that I think this journey from 2027 or 2028 to 2047, that 20-year journey from a $5 trillion economy to a developed economy, that's a qualitative journey. And it's not just quantitative. I think India for a very, very long time has been looked quantitatively. 1.4 billion population, 4 trillion, a 50% young workforce, so on and so forth. I think the focus needs to shift to the quality now and shift to those aspects of the Indian economy which are new, emerging, and which are capable of challenging the world through an Indian perspective. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
I think you left a very juicy part at the very end. India and China are moving away from the dollar. So, but I think, you highlighted again this journey toward 2047 as being an important project. You also, I think, articulated a little bit more related issues related to geopolitics, especially as India tries to maintain degrees of freedom as it relates to, oil. I think vis-à-vis the European Union, maybe as it relates to decarbonization, and that might have an impact on its own development strategy because these things will continue to exist. And then you highlighted that maybe this framework with the UK, the free trade agreement with the UK, could, in a certain kind of way, become a blueprint for others. We know that the EU, of course, is also negotiating with India right now. Before I give the floor to you for questions, comments, no short speeches, but maybe I should ask my panelists if they had one or two comments on each other's thoughts and considerations.
So,
Put the microphone in. Sorry.
some of the points that you can do. The fact that private investment has remained weak, I think, is one of the biggest challenges that India faces. Some of those are the structural issues, but also what we hear are some of the current issues. And I suppose this also links back to China and maybe the tensions sometimes between India and China are that there's a view in India that part of the concern and why manufacturers are hesitant to invest more is due to concerns that they're susceptible to lots of imports from China. So whereas capacity utilization in India now is reaching about 75%, which is usually a point where Indian companies start investing, they still seem to be holding back. Now, this is not, we still think the bigger issues in India are structural, but there seems to be this concern, and it's, I guess, partly the geopolitical concern that India is vulnerable to be, to have too many Chinese exports. I think Tendu also pointed out, India may be reaching a limit in how much it can step up further its capital expenditures, at least from the government capital expenditures. It's very much scaled up. It's doubled at the central level, its public infrastructure spending over a very short period of time as a percentage of GDP. And given its fiscal constraints, it's limited on how much more it can do, at least as a share of GDP. The hope is the states start stepping up more, but if anything, the Indian politics are going the other way, that the states are shifting more to current expenditures, and that becomes a concern. Tendu also brought up an important thing about the decarbonization issue for India. India has a net zero plan to reach in 2070, but India very much is concerned that they don't want to trade off growth too much relative to decarbonization, and that's a major concern. And I missed in my discussion, I really didn't focus on the great success of Indian services sectors. And I think, Tendu, you did a very justification on that side. Thank you.
Thank you. I think I wanted to thank both the panelists and also echo one point. Indeed, I think compared to China 20-some years ago, India faces somewhat different external environment. And 2 points you mentioned, one is globally, and I think it's not as welcoming in terms of a free big international markets, and secondly, of course, the energy and climate challenge. And so I think India indeed needs to probably explore a different path so that China's rise of manufacturing and industrialization, we don't have that kind of condition to follow the same path for sure. And one thing I wanted to, that I didn't mention as much is about, in terms of India's concern about importing foreign goods, especially Chinese goods, I suppose. And China, of course, I think just look at China itself. When it started the so-called big in, big out strategy, meaning importing a lot to export a lot. That strategy started in '87 and really took off in 2001, but already in the 90s was on that path. It, at some point, exports was 35% of GDP and imports was 31%. So you were, a lot of the import were processing trade. So you had to import a lot to export because China's manufacturing capacity in the 90s and 2000s was relatively low. So I think sometimes there is a lesson to be learned that for India, I understand the concerns about Chinese goods sweeping the market, but when it comes to intermediate products and equipment and components, maybe there are ways to facilitate that buildup of domestic manufacturing while protecting the end market. There are ways to do rather than universally just say restrictive of that, because I think it's very hard to see export really growing a lot without imports. If you look at other East Asian economies before China, the same as well. Finally, I think this is more of a concern and discussion. I think the director mentioned this about the digital economy and China, of course, pursuing high-end. I remember back in 2013-14 when Premier Li Keqiang encouraged innovation and entrepreneurship, and that became a national strategy. As an economist looking at 1.4 billion people, my initial response, my instinctive response is 1.4 billion people cannot be all engineers, innovative and entrepreneurs. Somebody's going to have to do the basic job, and the basic job is what generates employment for 1.4 billion people. So I think for both India and China, while both countries will for sure pursue the innovation, high-end manufacturing and so on, but when we are talking about the macro economy, lifting that country, to a certain level, we have to embrace the basic jobs and not look down on so-called low-end manufacturing. I think that is the case even for China right now, but probably also for India.
Yeah, good. With that, we'll start the Q&A session. If you could just give us your name, affiliation, and as short as possible. And if you have a particular person that you'd like to address, please go ahead. Otherwise, I'll just go around and pick somebody. So who wants to go first? Yes.
Hi, I'm Michael from MUFG macro research team. So I entered into this session actually thinking that there will be a lot more differences between the growth drivers of India and China. But having listened to everyone, I actually came out from this meeting thinking that there are a lot more similarities than I initially expected. Like factor reallocation between land and labor, growth despite of many of the challenges, and growth because of the differences in terms of reducing internal trade barriers, among others. So with that, for context, my question is this. So given what you know in terms of the policy direction for both India and China, do you think that both countries can enter into that new era, so to speak, in terms of the next growth level? And if not, what is that one thing that you think needs to change for that to happen? So that's the question for both India and China. Thank you.
Who wants to go first?
I guess on China, China has entered a new growth era, a relatively low growth era. But in terms of moving to the next stage of development, I think key reforms are still needed. The most important thing that I can highlight is, I think, the role of the private sector and the market. There has been a bit of a backtrack in the last few years, I think, to move in that direction. But also fundamentally, given that China is entering an aging society, fiscal reform, I would say, I mean, it's a little too complicated, but I would say for fiscal reform. Right now, in the next few years, I think a bigger policy boost, despite the fact that I think that they need fiscal reform, it doesn't mean they should do fiscal consolidation. I think they actually need to spend a lot more central government fiscal resources in boosting social safety net and consumption. China's problem is not that you don't have high-end manufacturing, and maybe not as good as the Western countries, but the biggest problem is lack of consumption and overcapacity. That has to be a jumpstart from the policy front.
So India needs a lot of reforms. But I'll say, if you think of the great success India has had over the past 25 years, is its services sector and digital services. Why? Because it wasn't affected by all the government rules and regulations, right? The labor laws did not really apply to the sector. The Factories Act does not apply to the services sector. So if you're asking me what, it's really the mentality that the government needs to not impose constraints on the private sector. I'll put it that way.
Thank you. In fact, that question, the one that you asked, I think has to be looked at in the point of view of the fact that when you look at the next generation of growth for the two countries, the growth characters are going to be very different. China can afford to focus intensively on something like, let us say, development of large language programs. It can afford to produce more DeepSeeks because the Chinese state is enormously well off financially. It can afford to bear failures. The Indian state cannot. And that is where the character of growth has to be differently guided. So in India's case, it has to be a question of private initiative and innovation, which needs to come out and bring growth accelerators. Whereas in China's case, it can be much more carefully guided by the state. In India's case, it has to be the private initiative. It has been the private initiative which has been doing all this for all this while. The challenge over there is to give the right ecosystem. Now, when we talk about services, I think Ranil and I agree that there used to be this common refrain throughout in India. It still continues to be done that the services sector performed the best in India because the government was nowhere near services. It never was. I mean, it's a product of what happened in 1991 and the economic liberalization in India. So I think that is something very fundamental. When we talk about India becoming a manufacturing powerhouse, we need to keep in mind the fact that India for 4 decades followed an industrial policy which never encouraged scale. Bulk of industrial production in India was reserved for the small scale. You never had scale, and Indian industry continues to suffer from the scale issue today. So I think it's important to look at the legacy. It's important to look at the history and then think about where the advantages lie and the productivity can come from.
Thank you very much. 1, 2, 3. Maybe what we could do is we will we'll have 3 questions in a row. If you could start first.
I'm Vikram Khanna, and I write for the Straits Times in Singapore. I think the last but one economic survey, there was a suggestion that India should welcome foreign investment from China. I wonder what's happened with that, and what would it do? What sectors would be the beneficiaries? And what would it do for Indian manufacturing? Is that a viable strategy for India to follow?
Mm-hmm. Very good. Then, yes.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I think one sector that didn't come out too well in the discussion is agriculture, although it did come out in the presentation initially. In the case of agriculture, if you look at like both India and China, I don't know about China so much about how its agriculture is and what have been the changes, but in India, we could see like a farmers' protest that went on when the government tried to come out with some reforms, right? And I'm not saying whether that was a right or a wrong direction to take, But given India's democratic system, given the kind of the farmers groups that are in over there, and given that India still has a huge labor force in agriculture, which perhaps have to be taken out, but then the challenges are there in the manufacturing sector as well. How much of a difference or a similarity do you see between the two countries? And if there is anything that can be learned, or does India have to take its own way in this sector? Thank you.
Yeah, we have one more in the last row. Sorry, yeah.
Hi, my name is Andrew Fennell with Citibank here in town. Just one question for Dr. Salgado. You mentioned that the IMF's policy advice is to pursue a revenue-based fiscal consolidation. Could you talk a bit more specifically about where you see the opportunities for the authorities to enhance revenues and what type of strategies you recommend at this stage? Thank you.
Ranil, do you want to go first?
Sure. So yes, the chief economic advisor is actually relatively more supportive of foreign investment from China. In particular, he'd argue that's the best way for India to get technology transfer. Of course, it's being hit by a lot of geopolitical considerations over time. If you look about a year ago, the geopolitical issues seem to be coming down. They seem to have rebounded again more recently. So that's been some of the constraints in terms of moving there. So the chief economic advisor was basically arguing the way we will get technology is by inviting Chinese investment, Chinese workers, Chinese managers, Chinese engineers to come work in India. An example I would give is we visited a solar panel plant in Hyderabad area in India. And India's goal is solar panels should have Indian components. Some of those, most basic things, some of the silicon has to come from places like China. But more so, all the equipment that were used to manufacture these panels were Chinese equipment. So if all imports from China, I think Tao mentioned this earlier, Wang Tao mentioned this earlier, that if India was going to block those intermediate goods, such as in this case, the equipment that manufactures the solar panels, then India wouldn't be able to manufacture the solar panels at all. In terms of, I feel very uncomfortable talking about agricultural reform, so I don't know, maybe the others can talk more about that. I'm not an agricultural expert. India tried to take some steps in agricultural reforms a few years ago. Basically, the idea was to remove the middleman, which is a major source of problem in the agricultural sector for India. That failed politically, not because it was all farmers in India were opposed to the idea, simply because farmers in states around Delhi were opposed to the idea. And you had farmers from the Punjab and Haryana come and block the streets in Delhi, and that's basically stopped the entire reform process. So even relatively small vested interests can block progress. Some would argue the government didn't do a good job in explaining its reforms, which most economists thought were good. In terms of revenue-based consolidation, when you look at when GST was initially planned, basically with a more simple structure, the expectation was GST would yield 2% higher relative to GDP, 2% of GDP higher in terms of revenues. So what has happened though is over time, first when it was introduced, it was much more complicated than the hope. It has basically 5 rate tiers. You can even argue more than 5 rate tiers. It was overly complicated. It reduces potential efficiency gains you can have. So about half of what we think could be improvement in revenue would come from GST simplification. And then the second area is basically to broaden the income tax base. An example in India is that the threshold where you first pay income taxes in India is 3 times median income, whereas a more typical would be 1 times median income. In the last budget, they actually did further tax cuts to raise the threshold even higher. So much of the rest of the gain can come from broadening the income tax base. I'll stop there.
I think you wanted to touch the difficult part of the agriculture.
Just to come back to China, 1978 reforms and opening up the 4 core pillars of the Deng Xiaoping modernization began from factor markets, began from agriculture decollectivization, followed onto the industrial sector, and then went forward. India never attempted any reforms in its factor markets. Never. The only factor market, the first factor market that came up for reforms was the capital market. India never went for reforms in the firm sector at any stage of its reform policy. People talk about the political ease or difficulty of reforming agriculture. Well, we have had in India for the last 12 years, Ranil, a fairly strong, politically strong government which could not reform agriculture. Now, I don't think it's a question of politics anymore. It's just a question of India having missed the agriculture reform bus. It cannot rewrite history because today the interests are so entrenched in agriculture that no political party in India can offer an alternative to the displacement and crumbling of those entrenched interests. So that will continue. The only way forward could be ad hoc actions by Indian states, which in their own capacity might be able to turn around agriculture the way they want to by ways of diversification, number 1. Number 2, pressures that are external to the system, for example, extreme weather events, which might force a state like Punjab to completely revise its agricultural policy or shift back from groundwater. Punjab has become, along with the largest producer of wheat, the largest producer of rice as well, which is remarkable because the Punjab conditions are never suitable for production of rice. Now, I think that's where the role of subsidies, politics, procurement, reforms, everything gets connected in such a counterproductive way that there's no looking forward to it and no political party wants to touch it. Political parties are happy talking about reforms from a distance today because the bulk of reforms have been done. The reforms that are left to be done are very difficult to be done. I think I'll stop there.
Thank you. Did you have?
Just very small thing on China agricultural sector. I agree. The most important reform in 1978 was actually the agricultural reform that was initiated by farmers who cannot survive anymore under the old system. And 2 years later, the central government finally approved that officially. But India, I just want to say, China and India has a very different agriculture in the sense that China has smaller arable land, even though it has a bigger land mass than India. And each individual families own collectively, the land is still owned collectively by each village, but distributed to individuals, everybody has a very small piece. So in other words, nobody really can make money in agriculture. It's a substantive agriculture. So the government's policy is to provide enough food so people don't starve. But the way forward for China's economy was always going to be people working in non-farming, non-agriculture. The biggest concern in the country when China joined the WTO, one of the biggest concern was China's agriculture was going to be wiped out by the opening of China's domestic markets. So at the time when Premier Zhu Rongji signed the agreement, domestically, he was really strongly criticized for being a traitor, selling out the domestic interest. Luckily, what happened is that, of course, the sector was not wiped out, and also other domestic reforms together left to a boom in urbanization that absorbed the labor from agriculture. So I think it's difficult to compared and say what India can take away, but also it's difficult to just identify the agriculture sector by itself because a lot of other things happened in China during that time that problems could have appeared, but they were subsumed by other developments.
I think we have come almost to the end, but I'll have maybe two more questions, 1 and 2, yeah?
Hi, I'm Andre Castaigne from Rockos Capital. I have a very simple question. Is India in a middle income trap?
Thank you, Alpha. Thank you very much for all the panelists for the sharing. It's very insightful. I have two questions. One question on Dr. Pally. You mentioned about, the service has to play a more important role in India's journey to become a high-income country. I share with your view on this, given the strengths on the Indian service sector, right? For example, the IT, right? So my questions to you is that India really able, if solely rely on the service industry, can create sufficient job for the Indian people, given that, India has become the most populous country on earth right now. Another question is that on whether or not India could become a manufacturing power. I noticed there's currently debate on India. So whether or not, it's calling about the development manufacturing industry, it's manufacturing in India or actually it's assembled in India because it's a large component actually is import abroad, primarily from China. So I want to hear our panelists' view on this, is whether or not it's a manufacturing in India, also actually essentially is assembly in India. Thank you.
Let's go first. You're next to me.
Okay. So I'll take the services question. No, the middle income. No, I don't think India is in a middle income trap because India is yet to reach middle income. It will perhaps think of falling in the trap or avoiding it when it reaches middle income. So I don't think we can have that conversation yet. On the other question, the services part, let's look at it this way. I mean, we typically believe in economic theory of structural transformation, that agriculture will slowly, in terms of employment, the space that is vacated will be picked up by the movement to manufacturing, and there will be that transition. In India's case, that has not happened. So in India's case, the structural narrative always talks about this missing middle. You have agriculture, the lowest share in GDP, but the largest share in employment. Whereas you have services, which has the highest share in GDP, not the largest share in employment, but there's an issue here. The issue is these numbers talk about the formal sectors of the economy. When we look at the informal sector of the economy, there could be a very different assessment that might meet us because we don't have the right amount of statistics and data to capture that. So when I refer to services, I refer to two components of it. One is the domestic component services, which is something like, let us say, transport. Something like government services. The government sector in India is huge. And the kind of government services, sheerly in terms of their value with respect to the GDP, is a huge number. When we are talking about external services, we tend to get carried away by IT. IT is important, but we don't talk about the professional and consultancy services, the management services, the IP-related services, the ones that fetch royalty, legal services. All these services are heavily important for India. They are bringing in revenues. And I think these are all getting reflected in the new generation free trade agreements that India is signing. For example, with the United Kingdom, which is a very service-heavy trade agreement, addresses mutual complementarities on both sides, but it's a services-heavy trade agreement. And when it comes to manufacturing, I think the simple answer, and I think Ranil will be able to substantiate it perhaps a little bit more. I think Indian manufacturing, broad-based manufacturing, is clearly not as competitive as several parts of Southeast Asia and also maybe some parts of South Asia. Even a country like Bangladesh, India's neighbor, might hold more competitive advantage in large-scale production of garments. But if you look at selective areas of manufacturing, pharmaceuticals, for example, India might well be having strong comparative advantage, but that's not going to be a sector which is going to absorb the labor force. And today, after urbanization and rapid urbanization, it is difficult to say how much of labor is actually in the rural areas and how much in the urban areas and how much in the intermediate areas. There is a tendency to connect the very poor part of the population with the rural population, which could be right. But then what about the urban poor? The urban population, but they are poor population. So I think a significant amount of policy rethink is regarded in this respect. And when we cast our attention out of the formal sector space, there are many new insights that come up.
Thank you very much. And I'm very happy that nobody mentioned the word AI so far. So that is for a different session. Brendan?
I'll just answer the question about assembly or manufacturing. China started with assembly. And I still remember this, one of these report by one of the consulting companies when Apple started to produce the iPhone, that the iPhone cost $400-500, but only $4 value added was in China, even though China exported. That's back then. Now, of course, a lot of Apple supply chain are, in the intermediate level are produced in China. You start low. And I also remember the time when, even clothing, China imported the cloth, the materials. It exported cotton, but then imported the cloth from the US, and the tanning was done in Korea, and the copper button was done somewhere else. It was just sewing, right? And now it had everything. Same with, the electronics. We had Panasonic and Toshiba and everything. Now you have Haier and media. You start from assembly. I think then you do learning by doing, you gradually catch up. I wouldn't really say, oh, just because I started with assembly, that doesn't mean I'm not manufacturing.
Yeah, thanks. I think my comments will fit in with the previous two. So India actually does, in small sectors where it requires few people, very sophisticated manufacturing. That's what parts of India look like advanced countries. Even where, there are a lot of GCCs you go, it looks like an advanced country. The problem in India is its laws have prevented Indian companies from any incentive to grow to employ lots of people. So I agree definitely with Wang here that what's wrong with India doing some assembly of Apple phones right now? Over time, they can do more in that sector. But if you look at, things like chemicals, if you look at pharmaceuticals, if you look at GCCs, India is very sophisticated and can do it. The only problem is it really, to me, this is the big issue, it really only helps relatively well-educated Indians at the top. They're the ones who are doing well. So the question is, can other Indians, without these changes in laws that would prevent Indian manufacturing from going to scale, can India support the rest of the economy rest of the people in the economy before they get better educated, before they have the higher skills? Some argue there are potential positive spillovers that can support non-tradable services that will help less educated Indians. I'm not fully convinced. I think both have to occur. India has to continue in terms of its high-skilled work, but it also has to open up for reaching scale so lower-income Indians can actually work in some of these plants. So I think you need a combination of the two.
Thank you very much. We've come to the end. I think we can continue the conversation. As Iqbal mentioned, we will have a large event on many of the issues, including on digital and fintech, cross-border payments, which you mentioned. In September, we will continue the series because it is an ongoing conversation, has many, many aspects. Again, I mentioned AI. I'm sure we'll have one on AI as well. But with that, I wanted to thank our panelists, Ranil, Tao Wang and Amitendo, for joining us today, and of course for my colleague Iqbal. Thank you very much, and to be continued.